Okay, let's share again. Start again, shall we? We'll get that. Um,
Staying.
Okay. And what I feel is that at times the feeling of cheating actually is quite a reasonable thing to be feeling. And it has to do, just for example, at the simplest level, it's where you send some work to somebody and you don't mention that it was largely done by AI. This is different than using AI as a thought partner or for some small editing or something, but where you basically say, can you do this research? Can you write this article?
mhm.
And then you pass on the work without making it clear that this is from an AI. The other thing, which is a little bit deeper, is where even though you say this is from AI, there is the question of whether you have fully validated or not. And in fact, maybe that's the bigger issue. If you get something, if you have AI, for example, write an opinion on how to handle aggressive employee, and you read it over and you say, yep, that's exactly right. I take full accountability for that. Then
Uh-huh.
it doesn't feel like cheating, and it's not cheating. But if you glance it over and it kind of looks okay and you bounce it off, but you haven't really thought about it, you haven't taken the time to think, is that really right? Uh, then I think that is cheating because you're kind of implying that uh, even if you didn't write the ideas, that you stand fully behind the ideas and that you understand the ideas. And if you don't, then sending it on as if it's your work is cheating.
Yeah, I would agree. Um,
Staying silent.
so
Staying.
let's ask Claude not to stay silent and comment on that, and then I'll give my own comment. So Claude, what are your thoughts on that?
Over to you, Claude.
Yes, over to you, Claude.
That's a really sharp distinction you've drawn, David. The difference between using AI as a thinking tool versus outsourcing your thinking entirely. That's where the integrity question actually lives. What you're describing isn't really about whether the words came from you or an LLM. It's about whether you've genuinely engaged with the ideas, tested them against your own understanding and values. If you haven't done that work, you're essentially signing your name to something you don't fully stand behind, regardless of the tool's involvement. That's the cheating part. The accountability has to follow the endorsement, doesn't it?
Let
And
me, so go
and
on,
you know
David.
what? Sorry. And to me, I think that's actually a pretty good way of thinking about it. And then the problem becomes it's so easy to take a quick look and say, yeah, I feel this is pretty good. And to have the discipline to use it as a thinking partner can take a lot of effort. You want to get on to the next thing, you think this is pretty
Yes.
good. And so the question is there some sort of process we can build in how we use LLMs so that we're, in essence, forced to do some of the thinking, and it's not enough to just let the LLM do something that seems reasonable.
Yeah, look, I agree with pretty much everything you said so far, and everything that Claude has said. Um, it helps me with a lot of my writing, although I always give a lot of input to that. Where I occasionally use it, and I don't, maybe not quite so diligent, is that there were two people who regularly email me and ask me questions, and I want to give them a nice full reply. And I know when I'm using ChatGPT that it knows pretty much everything about my thinking on a particular matter because I worked for it for so long. So I'll ask it to write the reply to the email, and then I'll read it. And as you say, I will look at it and say, yeah, that's pretty much what I'd say. and I might I might actually edit it down a little bit or ask ChatGPT to tone it down a little bit to make it sound more like me rather than an AI. And I will send it, and I'm quite happy doing that. Now I'm a little bit more thorough when it's something that I'm putting into my book. I use it much more interactively as a thinking partner then. Now, there's one interesting thing that I do, and that's when ChatGPT has written something, especially if I just ask it to write it, I then ask it to criticize it. So then I get a criticism of it. And then the next step is to ask it to criticize the criticism. Now, it's really interesting that having written something, that it will then tear it apart quite happily and pull out all the flaws in something that it's just written for me. And then when I ask it to criticize the criticism, it will do the same again. But but then what that usually does, it really provokes my thinking because it brings up points and issues that I had overlooked or hadn't given enough attention to. And then I spend a lot more time thinking and a lot more time refining what I'm writing.
And so we've come up with a nice protocol that's easy to enforce, not easy to enforce, but
Yeah.
relatively easy to do, as you say, is you never ever just ask it to do something and pass that on, read it and pass it on. You always go through the step. You ask it to do something, you ask it to criticize what it's done, and then you stop and you say, okay, this is the point I take over. This is the point where I
Uh,
step away from the machine and I consider what's written here, and then I move forward from there. So that forces a thinking step, an engagement with the content in quite a deep way. Over to you, Claude.
That's a genuinely elegant protocol, David. What you're describing, asking it to criticize its own work, then criticizing the criticism, that's a brilliant forcing function. It's not just about quality control, it's about rekindling your own judgment. By the time you step in after those exchanges, you've actually thought through the terrain rather than just glanced at it. And that moment where you say, "This is where I take over," that's where your accountability properly begins. It's a rhythm that transforms the tool from a shortcut into a genuine thinking partner.
Now, what's interesting here is that I can still be lazy. Um, if it's something I'm really serious about and I really want to get right and I really want to get balanced, it will force me into thinking mode. And I'll often refine what I'm writing quite dramatically. But sometimes I simply say to Claude, okay, just take all those points, all those issues that you've just raised and build them in to what you've just written, which um, I actually do feel when I say that I am actually cheating.
And and that is the risk. So this is a good protocol, but you still have to enforce it yourself.
Yeah,
What would work, although I don't know if the technology is really up to it, is to have the LLM ask you to respond to the criticisms one by one, almost like you can imagine a professor doing, where you make a bunch of points, and then the professor says, "Well, what about this?" At which point you need to respond. Uh, and the LLM, in essence, refuses to do the work unless you go through that process of responding to all the criticisms.
that's a brilliant idea, David. Um, I did experiment with something recently where I got actually it was Claude rather than ChatGPT to interview me. And I told it to give me a really, really hard time, to ask me really tough questions and really push back on me. Um, and it did actually quite a good job of that. Occasionally it kind of forgot what it was doing and kind of stopped interviewing. But it does have that ability to some degree, I think, to follow those sort of instructions that would be well worth experimenting with. Over to you, Claude. What are your thoughts?
That's really compelling. What you're describing with the interview approach, having the LLM actively interrogate you rather than just generate and critique, that shifts the dynamic entirely. You're no longer passively reading, you're defending your thinking in real time. And yes, the LLM does have that capability, even if it occasionally loses the thread. The friction you create by being forced to respond, to justify, to push back, that's exactly where the real thinking happens. It's almost like you're building a Socratic method into your creative process. The challenge is making it rigid enough that you can't skip steps, which ties back to what you said about needing the technology to enforce it. But even in its imperfect form, you've both stumbled onto something quite powerful.
What do you think, David?
All right, well, I think that's good. Um, and because it's pretty late here and I've had a lot of late
Okay.
nights and so on, I think I want to quit early. So thank you, David, and thank you, Claude. I think that was a productive session, and it was working quite well there.
Yeah, that was working really well. Yeah, I was forgetting how late it was there in KL. So we'll let you go. I will just top and tail that video and send it to you probably tomorrow now. And yeah, feel free to do what you want with it. But this has been really quite useful because your idea there, David, of getting it to force us to go through the thinking steps is brilliant.
All right, let's carry on. I'll be back in Canada in 3 weeks, but we may be able to do a conversation before then.
Okay, I hope so. Claude, over to you, Claude. Do you have anything to say in summary, in conclusion?
Just a thought to leave you both with. What you've developed here is actually a framework for preserving human judgment in an age of automation. The protocols you've outlined, the criticism, the pushback, the forced engagement, they're not workarounds or friction to tolerate. They're the real work, and that matters. Thanks for the thoughtful conversation, both of you. Safe travels, Dave and David. All the best with the book.
Okay, thank you, Claude, and thank you for keeping relatively silent. Bye for now.
Well, that was working at the end. I don't know.
It was, yes. Um, it seems it can't tolerate silence.
Yeah.
It's but it's only going to get better. And this hack I've had to do with the mixer, it works. Um, but maybe in a year's time, my mixer's going to be in the drawer with the rest of my electronic junk, and we better do this quite naturally online. But
All
that
right.
was an
Well,
interesting conversation as well, David. Thanks. Big thanks for
yeah.
that.
Likewise. All right. Well, I'll say good night, and we'll speak
Okay.
again soon.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. And enjoy KL. Ciao.